Today we're going to barrel age a bourbon and make poor man's Pappy. For this recipe, you're going to need a measuring cup, a funnel, a fine mesh strainer, a bottle, a kitchen scale, and a small oak barrel. The ingredients are W.L. Weller bourbon and limestone filtered water. Pappy Van Winkle bourbon is the elusive white whale of the bourbon world. It's reached a mythical status and commands incredible prices in secondary markets. And at this point, it's not just the price that prevents most people from trying it. It's also the scarcity of it. Pappy is what's known as a wheated bourbon, or sometimes called a wheater. The majority of bourbons are made with a recipe that's mostly corn, some rye, and a little malted barley. Wheated bourbons replace the rye with wheat, so it's corn, wheat, and barley. Bourbons with rye in their mash bill tend to have a spicier quality, and wheated bourbons tend to be sweeter and milder. Pappy Van Winkle and W.L. Weller are made from the same mash bill, so the ratio of corn to wheat to malt is the same in the $18 bottle of Weller Special Reserve as it is in the $3,000 bottle of Pappy 23 Year. The biggest difference between Pappy and Weller is the age, but also less tangible things like barrel selection and its placement in the rickhouse. The most widely accepted formula for poor man's Pappy combines Weller 12 Year and Old Weller Antique. However, at this stage in the game, Weller 12 is harder to find than Pappy. Perhaps this is because it was considered the cheaper alternative to the holy grail of bourbon. But whatever the reason, Weller 12 is rare, and if you do find it, it probably won't be priced for the poor man. So for the person who's poor in money, and in the time and resources needed to track these things down, reach for a bottle of Old Weller Antique. You might be tempted just to stop there, but if you're a patient poor man, you can push it a little further. Keep in mind that this is an approximation, and it's mostly for fun. It's not going to replace the real Pappy, but this process will change the flavor of the Weller and make it a smoother, sipping bourbon. It's also a way to make a poor man's Pappy old-fashioned, without all the guilt of pouring a $2,000 bottle into ice and sugar and bitters. The idea of this batch is to try and simulate the Pappy 20 Year. That's the one that's rated 99 out of 100, and can turn the disenfranchised Anthony Bourdain into a squealing teenage girl in the clutches of Beatlemania. Pappy 20 is bottled at 90.4 proof, so we're going to bring the 107 proof of the Weller Antique down by adding water. You could also try using Weller Special Reserve. It's the same thing as Weller Antique, but diluted down to 90 proof. It won't be able to achieve the 90.4 proof without the Antique, but if that's what you have to work with, it'll be fine. Obviously, if you're using the Special Reserve, you won't need the water. The water you use to dilute the bourbon will have a big impact on the flavor. You'll want to use something like what they use in Kentucky, which is water that's been filtered through limestone. Buffalo Trace, the distiller of Weller bourbon, uses this limestone filtered water in their whiskeys. If you don't have access to Kentucky limestone filtered water, don't worry, because the folks at Old Limestone have taken it and bottled it. They're located just downriver from Buffalo Trace, and are ideal for making up a batch of poor man's Pappy. Weller Antique used to be bottled at 7 years, but is currently being bottled without an age statement. So it's probably somewhere between 4 to 6 years old. So to make up that time, we're going to need to age it some more. The small oak barrel I have comes from Bluegrass Barrels, which is based in Kentucky and sources their materials from used bourbon barrels. This barrel is 1 liter, which is probably the best size for this, because you want to fill it all the way to the top to prevent the barrel from drying out. So filling up a bigger barrel would take more bottles. The full-size barrels used for bourbon production hold 53 gallons, which are almost exactly 200 times larger than this. Because this barrel is so much smaller, you can age the bourbon faster, due to the fact that more liquid comes in contact with the barrel. So assuming the ratio of size to aging was linear, adding another 14 to 16 years to the Weller would take about 30 days. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Buffalo Trace ran a similar experiment with smaller barrels, and their findings were that it didn't work the way they wanted it to. But we're going to do it anyway. Before we get started, we'll have to cure the barrel. Do this by filling it with warm water and dumping it out again. Small amounts of water may leak from the head or the butt. In that case, you'll need to cure it again. The idea is to get the water to expand the wood until it creates a seal. Once it's cured, it's time to add the bourbon. Prep your kitchen scale. Set it from ounces to grams, or milliliters if your scale has it. but grams is fine because 1 gram is the same as 1 milliliter. Put your measuring cup on your kitchen scale and zero it out. Measure 155 milliliters of old limestone, or 5 1/4 ounces. Pop in your funnel and pour it in your barrel. Next, we'll measure out the bourbon. Put your measuring cup on the scale again and zero it out. Then measure out 845 milliliters of Old Weller Antique. If you want to eyeball it, go for it. It's a whole 750 milliliter bottle and another 95 milliliters, which is just a hair under 3 1/4 ounces. But to be really precise, use the scale and pour that into the barrel. Then plug in the bung and wait 30 days. It's always a good idea to taste a little along the way. That way you can see how it's progressing. It may take a little more or a little less than 30 days. 30 is a good benchmark, but let your taste buds be the judge. After it's done aging, unplug the bung. Turn on your spigot and drain the barrel. It's normal if you lose a little in the aging process. Stick in a funnel and pour it in your bottle using the fine mesh strainer. That'll help pick up any little bits of charred oak that might have come through. Slap on a homemade label and you're good to go. Taste it, swirl it around in a nosing glass, pour it on the rocks, make a killer old fashioned with it. Go crazy. But as good as the poor man's Pappy old fashioned is, this bourbon's good enough on its own. It brings its own bells and its own whistles. You might not need anything else. And there you have it. Poor man's Pappy. The 20-year formula. Enjoy. Click here for more videos. Be sure to subscribe and check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.